The Honorable Giulio Tremonti, the Finance Minister of Italy, Dr. Jose de Gregorio, the Governor of the Central Bank of Chile, Ambassador Miriam Sapiro, Dr. Yossi Bachar, Danny Rothschild, ladies and gentlemen, let me warn you that I'm going to speak mainly in English, and towards the end I will switch for a short while into Hebrew. The starting point for this presentation is to recognize that any country that came through the global financial crisis relatively well, without a deep recession, without a significant financial crisis, is likely today to be facing difficult problems in managing its economy, particularly with regard to the exchange rate. That's not supposed to be there yet. Yeah. I think I need technical assistance, please. Okay. Some people, for example, the finance minister of Brazil, have related the difficulties that economies that came through the crisis well are facing now to currency wars, the use of the exchange rate as a strategic weapon of international competition. And many have been concerned that these currency wars will turn into trade wars. Now, why are there these fears? They are there because everybody who studies history and who was around just 2 years ago, 2 years and a few months ago in September, October 2008, was very worried that we were going to see, to our amazement, a repeat of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the Great Depression of the 1930s was characterized, among other things, by two macroeconomic international phenomena. One, competitive depreciations, competitive devaluations, with each country trying to devalue against the other to be able to increase exports. And secondly, protectionism on a very large scale. The Great Depression was marked by a massive decline in the volume of international trade, a decline which undoubtedly contributed to the intensity of that crisis. We were very worried at the beginning of this crisis. There are many who still think of this as a Great Depression, although it's now being called the Great Recession. But in the Great Depression, unemployment in the United States reached 25%. A quarter of the labor force was unemployed in 1933, and 24% was unemployed in 1932. And output fell by 25%. This was something which we came nowhere near to achieving, or achieving is the word, suffering from this time around. And part of the reason we didn't suffer from it is that there's been remarkably little protectionism in the wake of this crisis. Everybody can point to things that governments did to defend their domestic industry, tilting mikrazim, tenders, towards their national companies, and various devices like that, but there has been no large-scale protectionism. Global trade collapsed more rapidly in the the last quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009 than it came close to doing the beginning of the Great Depression. But then it bounced back very quickly, and if I can just show you, if I can figure out how to work this, what happened to trade, you can see there that the volume of world trade fell by 11% in 2009, and it bounced back immediately 1 year later. Nothing like that happened in the Great Depression. And part of the reason for that is that one of the most effective of all the international organizations is perhaps the least known is the World Trade Organization, which has enforcement procedures within it, so that if one country undertakes protectionist measures against another, there is a procedure for the country which believes it has been damaged to claim compensation from the country causing the damage, and this apparatus works. And this is a remarkable change. In every single recession since at least I've been aware of recessions, they all start with a series. This time there's going to be a lot of protectionism. Maybe one day there will be. But until now, for 50 years, it hasn't worsened during recessions. With regard to competitive depreciations of the 1930s, the current equivalent is supposed to be currency wars, particularly in the context discussed by the finance minister of Brazil, Manteiga, when the Fed announced its QE2, quantitative easing 2 policy, of buying $600 billion of government bonds. I don't believe there have been currency wars. I don't believe the United States has been using its monetary policy deliberately to create a devaluation and inflict harm on other countries. And I want to explain why. QE2, quantitative easing 2, was a United States effort to accelerate the recovery of the United States economy. Any expansionary monetary policy tends to reduce the interest rate and to weaken the exchange rate. That's part of how an expansionary monetary policy or a reduction in interest rates usually works. Given that the Fed could not reduce interest rates below the practically zero, they instead went out and bought longer-term bonds and reduced their interest rates in order to get the US economy back growing again. And that's what happened. I didn't think there was an attempt focused on the exchange rate, as so many others think. And as I commented to Israeli newspapers at the time, if I'm given a choice in Israel between having to deal with a situation in which, call it A, the US is growing slowly and I don't have to worry about my exchange rate very much, and B, a situation in which the US is growing more rapidly and I have to worry a bit about my exchange rate, I prefer B, because until the US starts growing decently, which it's on the way to doing, the global economy is not going to come back to health, and I believe that the effort of the Fed and the later agreement between the President and the Congress on fiscal policy are the things that are beginning to return the US to growth of above 3%. And that is a plus, and that's why the outlook looks reasonable in this chart, and why, when you look at what is predicted by the IMF for the United States in 2011, it's more rapid growth than in 2010. 6 months ago, that number was below the predicted 2010 growth rate. So I think the US was doing what needs to be done for growth. Furthermore, I believe that when the US starts growing more rapidly, the dollar will strengthen and money will start flowing into the United States. This is not to say that there are countries that there are no countries that use their currencies as a major part of their economic policy, and of course that I'm referring particularly to China, which has kept its currency lower than market would want it to be if the government wasn't intervening, and that's what's responsible for the fact that China has accumulated $2.8 trillion of reserves. Sorry, I'm going to keep doing this until I get to the end. Now, the concern over currency wars translates into a concern for a country like Israel that the exchange rate not appreciate excessively. That's our problem, that's Brazil's problem, that's the problem of many countries in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe. Among the countries that suffered most from an appreciated exchange rate in this crisis has been Switzerland. Why? Because Switzerland sits in the middle of Europe. When there were concerns about the euro, every country around Switzerland, citizens wanted to send their money to a place which looked more promising, and there were massive inflows into the Swiss economy. There is a problem in the international economy which is related to the existence of what is called currency wars, which is we do not have rules, accepted rules of behavior for exchange rate management in the global economy. We don't have rules on how much you're permitted to intervene, how much foreign exchange you can buy, as we do have rules for international trade in goods. Countries have agreed not to raise their tariffs. That's part of the system. There are no such rules for capital movements, and it is important that the IMF is now trying to develop such rules to figure out what works and what doesn't work when the exchange rate starts appreciating, how countries can affect it, and what measures they can take that are acceptable from the viewpoint of managing the international economy. Those are rules we have to develop, just as we develop rules gradually in the years since the 1950s that have produced a global trading system that is a linchpin of the success of the global economy. But now I go back to the fact that any country that came through the global financial crisis relatively well, without a deep recession, without a significant financial crisis, is likely to be facing difficult problems in managing its economy, particularly with respect to the exchange rate. A professor whom both Governor De Gregorio and Minister Tremonti know very well, my former colleague, Professor Franco Modigliani, who was a cousin of the other Modigliani, and a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and one of my teachers always used to expound a theory and then say, in a typical country, Italy, for example. Well, I'm going to take a typical country, Israel, for example. And let me describe what's happening in the Israeli economy and how these phenomena that I've been talking about are affecting the Israeli economy and the policy choices we have to make. This economy is growing. We had a very brief recession in 2008, and we grew only 0.8%, but most countries didn't grow at all. Last year we grew, that's the first estimate, at 4.5%. That 3.8% number there is a forecast which I have no doubt will be increased for 2011. So we are growing. We did not have a financial crisis, but we had better not forget that it was not easy, that it was not smooth sailing. There were concerns about the banks at various times. And one of the great problems of a banking system is that concerns about it can translate into reality very quickly. There can be self-fulfilling runs on banks, and so maintaining confidence in banks is absolutely essential, and the government and the Bank of Israel had to work to do that. It didn't just happen. There were heavy losses in pension funds and other funds, and the government had to come up with a financial safety net, which in the event, because the economy recovered quickly, it was not in fact needed, but it needed to be provided to reassure people. Even before Lehman Brothers, we found ourselves with a rapidly appreciating exchange rate. And you can see what happened in 2008 over there in the development of the dollar from late 2007, when it was at about a value above 4 to the dollar, to July 2008, when it reached just above 3.2. That's a massive appreciation. Why did it happen? Because Israelis were bringing their money home after having sent it abroad in search of better returns, and realizing as the global crisis developed that there were better returns in Israel than there were abroad, and that pressure led to an appreciation of the currency. We decided to intervene in the foreign exchange markets. This was not an easy decision because we had not intervened for 10 years. Why did we do it? Well, we saw the recession coming. It was clear already in the beginning of 2008 that we were heading for big trouble. And we were not prepared to have, for this economy, a double hit. A hit from the global recession, which was coming, and a 20% appreciation just before the recession was going to hit, the global recession was going to hit us. So we decided we were not going to penalize 45% of our production, which is exports, by having the exchange rate appreciate 20%. And we intervened on a big scale, and we caused the exchange rate to bounce back to roughly where it had started. That was a very big operation where we bought a lot of reserves. But we had wanted to build up reserves. We had long felt in the Bank of Israel that our reserves were inadequate, that by the normal criteria for reserves, we were low. Rating companies used to ask us about that. And furthermore, we mentioned very discreetly that Israel has a special geopolitical situation, and the normal criteria for holding reserves probably are not sufficient, and that we felt we needed to hold more than that. So our reserves, which had been pretty flat, as you can see, for a very long time at around 27, 28 billion, we started buying first slowly, and then we increased it to $100 million a day. And we are today, that number came out today, at $73 billion in reserves. Do we feel badly about it? No. At least I feel much more reassured, and I think recent events should explain why we feel more reassured about having these reserves. Now, with regard to our current situation, inflation in Israel is above our target level of 2%, And because commodity prices and energy prices are rising, the markets expect these prices to rise. We raised the interest rate for February. It's now 2.25%. It had been only 0.5%. But doing this exposed us to short-term capital inflows. And just to give you some numbers, the currency that people who bring money to the asset that people who bring money to Israel want to buy, Bank of Israel short-term bills, makam, and between the end of September, when we raised the interest rate from 1.75% to 2%, and the end of October, $4 billion of makam were bought by foreigners. The holdings of makam by foreigners at the beginning of this year were under at the beginning of 2010, were under 10 billion. They are $10 billion. They're now $28 billion. So in a year, foreigners increased their purchases of our short-term bills by $18 billion in an economy where the GDP is about 220, nearly 10% of GDP. This is huge, absolutely massive, and it puts pressure on the exchange rate. So now you can say, well, you have a currency war being waged against you. I don't think that's what we have. I think what we have is the US and other countries and Europe trying to get themselves out of their recession, and we're in the fortunate position of having already ended our recession and growing quite respectably, and so we need higher interest rates. And an accompanying phenomenon is these short-term capital inflows. So what do you do to prevent those inflows? Well, you intervene. We've done a lot of intervening. You see that there. And we've also recently started undertaking measures, administrative measures, to moderate these short-term inflows, which produce undesired effects on the exchange rate. These controls are inelegant. They are undesired. I hope they're temporary, but they are necessary at this stage. We have another problem as a result of the international environment. Our interest rates are very low, and that tends to increase asset prices, including housing prices. But what you see here is what's happened to Israeli housing prices and those of a few other countries. Between 2000 and 2009, German housing prices decreased slightly. Between 2000 and 2008, Israeli housing prices looked like German housing prices. That's the blue line is Israel. Since 2008, as we cut the interest rate to nearly zero and as mortgages were available at less than 2% on a floating rate basis, housing prices in Israel have risen from about 95 here to about 145 there in about 2.5 years. They're rising at a little under 20% a year. That's a very, very rapid rate. If you want to see the dangers of having housing prices rise very rapidly, follow this line, which is Ireland. And you'll see that Irish housing prices reached 225 or 210 in 2007 and are now at 130. If you hold a house in Ireland, you're in trouble. We do not want to be in that situation. We do not want to let this housing price rise get out of control to the point when we will see curves beginning to look like this, or even worse, like that one, or not quite as bad like that one. That's what we are nervous about. That is why we are using so-called macroprudential interventions to deal with the housing price bubble. Now I want to turn to the final issue, which is the geopolitical situation, and I want to speak Hebrew. This is too serious for English. אז אני רוצה להתייחס לסוגיית המצב הגיאופוליטי. מזמן בנק ישראל התחיל להדגיש את העובדה שזה גורם שאנחנו צריכים לקחת בחשבון בכל ההחלטות שלנו כבנק מרכזי, ושהמדינה צריכה לקחת בחשבון, ובהיבטים מסוימים בוודאי לוקח את זה בחשבון, למשל בהיבט הביטחוני. אני מדבר עכשיו רק על מדיניות כלכלית. הנה משהו שנשמע מאוד אזוטרי, זה העלות לאנשים שרוצים לקנות ביטוח בשווקים נגד האפשרות שממשלת ישראל לא תשלם את החובות שלה ל5 שנים. אז זה נותן לך את הביטוח ל5 שנים, זה עולה לך לפני פחות מ4 שנים, זה עלה לך 20 נקודת בסיס, 0.2. לא ראו סכנה בישראל. בשיא המשבר, העלות הגיעה לכמעט 3%. אז זה ירד לסביבה של, לאחרונה, 115 נקודות בסיס, ועכשיו אני עובר לאיור השני. היינו ב-115 נקודות בסיס, 1.15%, ואז קרה מה שקרה במצרים, והעלות קפץ ב30 נקודות בסיס ל-1.45%. וזה ירד לאחרונה לבערך 1.30. השווקים מספרים לנו משהו שאנחנו יודעים. זה שהמצב, שהסיכונים הגיאופוליטיים עלו, אנחנו יודעים את זה, השווקים יודעים את זה. אז מה עלינו לעשות? וכאן אני מסיים. אני רוצה להתחיל בהדגשה שיש לנו משק מאוד חזק, מאוד איתן, בעל חוסן, מרשים. אם אתה לא מאמין שיש לנו משק מסוג זה, תחשוב על הזעזועים שעברנו מאז, לפחות שאני הגעתי, ואני לא רואה משהו, אומרים באנגלית קוזלי, בין ההגעה שלי והאירועים. יש בין האירועים, יש את המחלה העצובה של ראש הממשלה שרון, יש את הניצחון של חמאס בבחירות של הפלסטינאים, היה מלחמה בלבנון, היה מלחמה בעזה, היה המיתון הגלובלי, ובמשך כל התקופה הזאת, המשק הישראלי המשיכה לצמוח, ובמשך המיתון כמעט ולא נפגע, ובוודאי נפגע הרבה פחות מכל המשקים המערביים האחרים. יש לנו משק שיכול להתמודד עם בעיות, זה לא הבעיה. אבל אנחנו צריכים לנהל את המשק כך שאם יהיה משבר בעתיד, אם יהיה התדרדרות נוספת במצב הגיאופוליטי שלנו, אם יהיה זעזועים אחרים למשק, נוכל לטפל בהם מעמדת חוסן ולא מעמדת חולשה. יש אלו שמדברים על הצורך להגדיל את התקציב הביטחוני. תראו מה קרה לתקציב הביטחוני מאז 2060. זה היה 9% של התמ"ג ב-1960. זה היה 9% של התמ"ג. אז התחיל, אז מלחמת ששת הימים, והתקציב הביטחוני הגיע ל-20% של התמ"ג. מלחמת יום הכיפורים, מעל 30% של התמ"ג. אם אתה מוציא 30% של התמ"ג על ביטחון, יש לך בעיה במשק. ובמשך השנים הצלחנו להוריד את האחוז של התמ"ג שהממשלה מוציאה על ביטחון ל7.5%. יש הוצאות נוספות שבעצם מגדיל את הסכום הזה לבערך 9.5% של התמ"ג. יכול להיות שהמספר הזה יעלה. אם ננהל את עצמנו באופן נכון, נוכל להתמודד עם זה. אז מה אנחנו צריכים לעשות? אנחנו בבנק ישראל צריכים לשמור על יציבות מחירים, זאת אומרת על אינפלציה נמוכה. אנחנו צריכים לשמור על רמות יתרות גבוה, כדי שאם יהיה את הצורך נוכל להביא לארץ מה שאנחנו צריכים להביא. אנחנו צריכים לשמור על מערכת בנקאית חזקה ואיתנה. ומה עם הממשלה? הממשלה צריכה לשמור על התקציב, צריכה לשמור על המשך הירידה ביחס החוב לתמ"ג בארץ, שעכשיו נמצא בהשוואה בינלאומית ברמה יחסית נמוכה של פחות מ-80%. התקציב שלנו היה תחת שליטה, והמדיניות הפיסקלית מזמן היה ממושמעת. היה עלייה בגירעון בתקציב ב-2009 ל5% של התמ"ג, זה גבוה מאוד, זה היה כמעט 0 ב-2007, ב-2010 זה ירד ל3.7%, התקרה ל-2011 זה 3%, התקרה ל-2012 זה 2%. זה מדיניות פיסקלית מבחינת המצרפים מצוינת. אנחנו צריכים לשמור על זה. הממשלה העבירה את התקציב הדו-שנתי לפני חודש וחצי. ואנחנו צריכים להוכיח לעצמנו ולכולם שאנחנו יכולים לשמור על המשמעת הפיסקלית. זה לא הזמן להתחיל לשחק עם התקציב חודש וחצי אחרי שזה הועבר. אסור לנו להתבלבל כתוצאה של העובדה שהתקציב, שהתקבולים של הממשלה ב-2010 היו גבוהים מהצפי. אין לנו כסף לבזבז. יש לנו צורך לשמור על מה שיש לנו. אנחנו צריכים להתנהג באחריות, זה מתייחס לממשלה, ושם אני רוצה להגיד שהאוצר מתנהג לגמרי בסדר, וששר האוצר לוחם כדי לשמור על התקציב, על מסגרת התקציב. זה מתייחס לכולם במערכת הפוליטית, שחושבים שאנחנו במצב נורמלי. המצב אצלנו השתנה. זה השתנה לפני שבועיים. מיום ליום האי-ודאות תעלה ותרד. אבל יש הרבה יותר אי-ודאות היום ממה שהיה רק לפני שבועיים. אז מה השורה התחתונה שלי? קרן המטבע כשהוא מבקר במדינה, והכל פחות או יותר בסדר, לא יודע מה לעשות, ואומר, צריכים להימנע משאננות. אנחנו צריכים להימנע משאננות. לא היה לנו משבר פיננסי. אבל להגיד שזה היה קל, זה שאננות. זה היה קשה. אנחנו צריכים לעבוד כדי לשמור על המצב הזה. ועוד דבר, צריכים להימנע מפופוליזם. וזה דבר שממש מפחיד אנשים שחושבים על מה קורה במשק. אני בטוח שנעשה את זה, אבל זה דורש מאמץ. אני יודע שבנק ישראל יעשה את חלקו, אני מצפה שהאוצר יעשה את חלקו, אני מקווה שכל האחרים יעשו את חלקם. תודה רבה.